June 4, 1942. Dawn. The Pacific is unnaturally calm. A pale light spreads across the empty horizon, touching steel flight decks that float like islands in the open sea. On board American aircraft carriers, men move quietly. Boots scrape metal. Engines cough to life, then settle into a low, steady growl. Faces are tight. Eyes scan the sky. Far beyond the curvature of the ocean, the Imperial Japanese Navy is doing the same. For 6 months, Japan has not known defeat. Its carriers have struck with precision across half the world. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies. Confidence has hardened into certainty. This morning is meant to finish what began in December. Below decks, bombs are stacked. Fuel lines run full, orders are written and rewritten. Somewhere in the vastness of the Pacific, 2 fleets are converging toward a point neither can see, guided by assumptions, intelligence, and belief. No one aboard these ships knows that within hours, the balance of naval power in the Pacific will fracture beyond repair. To understand how this morning became inevitable, the story must begin months earlier, when the war itself was still finding its shape. The war in the Pacific did not begin with uncertainty. It began with shock. On December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy attacked Pearl Harbor with a force built around 6 aircraft carriers. In less than 2 hours, battleships burned, aircraft were destroyed on the ground, and the United States was hurled into a global war it had tried to delay. For Japan, the strike confirmed years of naval planning. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, now decided the fate of oceans. In the months that followed, Japanese momentum seemed unstoppable. Hong Kong fell by Christmas. Singapore collapsed in February 1942. The Philippines were overrun. Shrong Frun. Oil fields in the Dutch East Indies were seized almost intact. The Imperial Navy moved like a blade across the map, its carrier task forces operating with speed and coordination unmatched by any opponent. At the center of this strategy stood Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a veteran naval aviator and former naval attaché to Washington. Yamamoto understood American industrial power better than most in Tokyo. He did not believe Japan could win a long war. His answer was decisive battle, one massive blow that would cripple the US Navy so completely that America would negotiate rather than rebuild. Pearl Harbor had been that first blow, but it had not destroyed the American carriers. They had been at sea. By early 1942, those carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, Yorktown and Hornet, were all that stood between Japan and uncontested control of the Pacific. They were fewer in number, their air groups less experienced, and their logistics stretched thin. Yet they remained afloat, striking back where they could. In April 1942, 16 US Army bombers launched from the carrier Hornet and struck Tokyo. The physical damage was limited. The psychological effect was not. For the first time, the Japanese homeland had been touched. Confidence cracked. Senior commanders realized that as long as American carriers existed, Japan was vulnerable. Yamamoto now pushed for a final solution. He proposed drawing the US carriers into battle and destroying them in a single, carefully staged operation. The location would be Midway Atoll, an isolated outpost roughly halfway between Hawaii and Japan. If Midway fell, Hawaii would be threatened. The Americans would have no choice but to respond. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized aggression, surprise, and the belief that well-trained crews could overcome numerical uncertainty. The plan for Midway reflected this mindset. The fleet would be divided into multiple task forces, spreading power across hundreds of miles. Submarines would screen the approach. A diversionary attack would strike the Aleutian Islands, pulling American attention north. From Tokyo, the operation appeared elegant. From the sea, it would be fragile. The United States, meanwhile, was rebuilding under pressure. Shipyards worked around the clock. Pilots trained at breakneck speed. Losses were accepted because there was no alternative. In April and May, American carriers fought Japanese forces in the Coral Sea. The battle ended tactically inconclusive but strategically significant. Japan lost the carrier Shoho. Shokaku was damaged. Zuikaku lost most of her air group. For the first time, Japanese expansion was checked. Yet neither side believed the decisive moment had arrived. That belief would soon be tested as the Japanese fleet began to move eastward, convinced it held the advantage. And beneath the surface of this confidence, an unseen war was already underway. While Japanese fleets maneuvered across the Pacific, another battle unfolded in windowless rooms thousands of miles away. In the basement of a nondescript building at Pearl Harbor, a small group of American intelligence officers worked around the clock. They belonged to Station Hypo, the U.S. Navy's Pacific Cryptanalytic Unit. Led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, the team was tasked with breaking Japan's naval code, JN-25, a complex system of numbers, additives, and encipherment designed to conceal operational plans. Progress was slow, frustrating, and incomplete, but fragments began to align. Intercepted messages repeatedly referenced a target labelled AF. The codebooks did not say what AF was. Rochefort believed it meant Midway. Others in Washington were skeptical. The risk of acting on an assumption was enormous. If the interpretation was wrong, the US carriers could be lured into a trap with no escape. To prove the theory, Rochefort proposed a simple test. Midway was instructed to transmit an unencrypted message stating that its freshwater system had failed. Shortly afterward, Japanese intercepts reported that AF is short on water. The confirmation was quiet but decisive. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the United States knew where Japan intended to strike, and roughly when. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, now faced a choice that would define the war. His carrier strength was thin. Lexington was gone. Saratoga was under repair. Yorktown had been heavily damaged at the Coral Sea and was expected to take months to fix. Nimitz ordered it done in 3 days. Workers swarmed Yorktown at Pearl Harbor, welding steel plates over shattered decks, patching fuel lines, replacing aircraft as fast as cranes could move. The carrier sailed with scars still visible, her crew aware that they were returning to battle before the ship was truly ready. By early June, Nimitz assembled what he could. 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet and Yorktown, 8 cruisers, 15 destroyers. Submarines positioned along likely Japanese approach routes. Land-based aircraft stationed on Midway itself. The plan was not to defend the island in the traditional sense. It was to ambush the carriers. Japanese forces approaching Midway represented the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaiga, Soryu and Haryo, each carried veteran pilots, many of whom had flown since China and Pearl Harbor. Battleships, cruisers and destroyers followed in support, though spread across separate formations. Yamamoto himself commanded from the battleship Yamato, far to the rear. He believed that once the American carriers appeared, they would be annihilated by superior Japanese coordination and experience. What Yamamoto did not know was that the Americans would already be waiting. On June 3, reconnaissance aircraft from Midway sighted elements of the Japanese invasion force. The following morning, June 4th, dawn broke with both fleets within striking distance, yet unaware of each other's exact positions. In the hours ahead, assumptions would collide with reality. Decisions made in minutes would outweigh months of planning, and the battle that followed would be shaped not just by firepower but by humans under unbearable pressure. That human dimension is where the story now turns. Before Midway became a battle of fleets, it was a battle of individuals. On American carriers, most pilots were young, many in their early 20s. Some had never seen combat. Others had survived Pearl Harbor and the frantic early months of retreat. Sleep came in fragments. Meals were skipped. The Pacific heat pressed down on metal decks, turning flight operations into endurance tests. Below decks, ordnance crews worked in near darkness, loading bombs and torpedoes by hand. Each weapon carried weight, not just in steel but in consequence. A single mistake could destroy a ship. Every man knew it. Across the ocean, Japanese carrier crews moved with practiced precision. These were veterans of 6 months of continuous victories. Their confidence was not arrogance, it was habit. They had trained longer, flown farther, and struck harder than any carrier force in history. Many believed the Americans no longer possessed the skill to challenge them directly. Yet beneath that confidence lay fatigue. Japan's elite naval aviators had been flying almost non-stop since December. Losses, though minimized in official reports, were irreplaceable. Training pipelines could not replenish experience at the same pace war consumed it. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz understood that information, not force, was his greatest advantage. He deliberately kept his carriers hidden northeast of Midway, outside expected Japanese search patterns. He trusted his commanders at sea to act independently if contact was made. Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, a cruiser commander by training, was placed in charge of Task Force 16. The choice was unconventional. Spruance had little carrier experience. But Nimitz valued his calm judgment and willingness to listen to his air officers, particularly Captain Miles Browning. In contrast, Japanese command was divided, literally and structurally. Yamamoto's fleet was spread over hundreds of miles. Carrier Commander Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo operated without real-time awareness of Yamamoto's intentions or American movements. Communication delays were measured in hours. Nagumo was cautious by nature, trained to preserve fleet integrity. That caution would soon collide with a rapidly changing battlefield. Radar was primitive but present. American ships could detect incoming aircraft at range, buying minutes that could mean survival. Japanese carriers relied more heavily on visual spotting and doctrine, confident in their ability to control the air through aggressive strikes. Most decisive of all was code-breaking. It did not fire a single shot. It dropped no bombs. Yet it placed American carriers exactly where they needed to be. As dawn approached on June 4, technology, leadership, and human endurance converged. Each side believed it held the advantage. None could see the full picture. The first aircraft were already lifting off their decks. From the bridge of the Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo watched the morning light spread across the sea. Reports indicated no sign of American carriers. To Nagumo, this confirmed what doctrine suggested. The US fleet would rush to defend Midway only after the island was struck. At 4:30 a.m., Nagumo launched his first wave, over 100 aircraft, toward Midway. Fighters, dive bombers and torpedo planes disappeared into the distance, engines steady, formations tight. The plan was working. Midway would be neutralized. A second strike would finish it if necessary. Then uncertainty intruded. At 7:28 a.m., a delayed scout plane reported sighting American ships east of Midway. The report was incomplete. It did not mention carriers. Minutes later, a correction arrived. Carriers were present. Nagumo now faced a dilemma with no clean solution. His aircraft were returning from Midway and needed to land. His reserve aircraft below decks were armed with land attack ordnance, not anti-ship weapons. To strike the American carriers, he would need time to recover aircraft, rearm and launch. He chose to wait. Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized concentrated strikes. Partial attacks were discouraged. Everything was to be launched together, overwhelming the enemy. But doctrine assumed clarity. Midway delivered confusion. As aircraft were rearmed below decks, American attacks began arriving in waves, uncoordinated, piecemeal and devastating in their persistence. Torpedo squadrons from Hornet, Enterprise and Yorktown attacked at low altitude, without fighter cover. They were slaughtered. Pilots flew straight into walls of anti-aircraft fire and zero fighters. Few survived. Their torpedoes rarely hit. Yet these attacks forced Japanese fighters to remain low, burning fuel and drawing attention downward. Above them, the sky emptied. Every command decision carried moral weight. Sending torpedo pilots into near-certain death was not a calculated sacrifice. It was a desperate attempt to disrupt the enemy's rhythm. The men who flew those missions understood the odds. They went anyway. Nagumo, trained to preserve his carriers, hesitated at the critical moment. His decks were crowded, fuel lines were exposed, bombs and torpedoes lay stacked in hangars, awaiting orders that kept changing. The battle had become unstructured. Plans dissolved under the pressure of minutes. Both sides were now reacting rather than executing. Somewhere high above the clouds, unseen and unheard, American dive bombers were searching the ocean, low on fuel, unsure of where the enemy was, with only instinct and timing left to guide them. The moment of decision was no longer approaching. It was already overhead. The sky over the Pacific was crowded with failure before it revealed success. American torpedo squadrons reached the Japanese fleet first. They came in low, slow and exposed, obsolete TBD devastators skimming just above the waves. Japanese lookouts spotted them early. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Zero fighters descended in tight arcs. Squadron after squadron was torn apart. From Hornet, Torpedo Squadron 8 attacked without fighter escort. Of 15 aircraft, only one pilot survived, Ensign George Gay, floating in the water as the battle continued overhead. From Enterprise and Yorktown, the story was the same. Courage without protection, persistence without reward. Yet their sacrifice mattered. Japanese fighters chased the torpedo planes down to sea level, leaving the high altitude unguarded. Fuel burned rapidly, Ammunition thinned. Pilots became fixated on the immediate threat below. Below decks, Japanese carriers were at their most vulnerable. Aircraft returning from Midway crowded the landing decks. Others waited in hangars, armed and fueled. Bombs meant for Midway lay next to torpedoes meant for ships. Fuel hoses snaked across the decks. Fires burned from earlier damage. At 10:20 a.m., American dive bombers arrived. They came almost by accident. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey of Enterprise had followed a lone Japanese destroyer racing north at high speed, Arashi, assuming it was returning to the fleet. The gamble paid off. The carriers appeared below, clustered together, turning into the wind to recover aircraft. From above they looked helpless. Dive bombers peeled off in silence. Sunlight flashed off wings. Sirens screamed as aircraft plunged almost vertically toward their targets. Anti-aircraft fire erupted too late. In less than 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were mortally wounded. Kagi was struck near the flight deck, her hangars erupting in flames. Kaiga absorbed multiple hits, explosions ripping through her interior. Soryo burned uncontrollably, her decks twisted and blackened. The heart of Japan's carrier force was shattered almost instantly. Only Harrier remained operational. Smoke climbed thousands of feet into the sky. Survivors leapt into the sea. Commanders struggled to comprehend what had happened. The battlefield fell eerily quiet, broken only by fires and drifting wreckage. But the battle was not yet finished. One carrier still had teeth. Aboard Harrier, Vice Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi acted without hesitation. While smoke from the burning carriers darkened the horizon, Harrier turned into the wind and launched her aircraft. Japanese pilots, still among the most skilled in the world, flew with precision and discipline. Within hours, they found the American carriers. The first strike hit Yorktown shortly after noon. Dive bombers pierced her defences, dropping bombs that ripped through the flight deck. Fires spread. Power failed. For a moment, the ship appeared doomed. Damage control parties worked with brutal efficiency, flooding compartments, isolating flames, restoring systems piece by piece. Within an hour, Yorktown was back in operation. Yamaguchi ordered a second strike, convinced the damaged carrier was a different ship. Torpedo bombers returned, striking Yorktown again. This time the damage was catastrophic. She lost power permanently, listing heavily, her fate sealed. The Japanese had struck back. But the cost was fatal. American scouts soon located Harrier. In the late afternoon, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown, launched before her final incapacitation, descended through broken cloud cover. Their attacks were precise and overwhelming. Harrier was hit repeatedly. Fires erupted across her decks. Ammunition detonated. Steering failed. As night fell, the carrier burned uncontrollably, drifting alone in the dark. Vice Admiral Yamaguchi chose to remain aboard. When orders came to abandon ship, he refused to leave. At dawn on June 5, Harrier was scuttled. With her sank the last operational Japanese fleet carrier at Midway. The battle had lasted barely a day. 4 Japanese fleet carriers destroyed. Over 300 aircraft lost. Hundreds of Japan's most experienced aviators gone forever. The Americans lost Yorktown days later to a submarine attack. But the strategic equation had already changed. For the first time since December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered an irreversible defeat. The momentum that once seemed unstoppable had vanished in smoke and flame. What followed would not be a return to equilibrium, but a slow, grinding shift in the balance of the war. When the smoke cleared over the Pacific, the silence felt unfamiliar. The Battle of Midway ended on June 7, 1942, not with a final clash, but with a withdrawal. Japanese forces retreated westward, leaving behind oil slicks, debris, and the bodies of men who had once believed the ocean itself was on their side. The battlefield was vast, but the result was unmistakable. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Harrier. More devastating than the ships themselves was the loss of trained air crews. Over 200 experienced pilots and flight deck personnel were killed. These men were the core of Japan's naval aviation arm, veterans shaped by years of combat and irreplaceable by any accelerated training program. American losses were significant but survivable. Yorktown was eventually sunk by the submarine I-168 while under tow. 1 destroyer, Hameen, was also lost. Aircraft losses were heavy. Pilots and crews paid dearly for victory. Yet the US Navy retained its remaining carriers, and more were already being built. The psychological impact in Tokyo was immediate and severe. Official communiques attempted to soften the blow, delaying acknowledgement of the scale of the defeat. The public was told little. Within the Imperial Navy, however, the truth was understood. The decisive battle Yamamoto had sought had occurred, and it had been lost. Strategically, Midway forced a fundamental shift. Japan could no longer plan large-scale offensive operations across the Pacific. The Aleutian diversion, once meant to stretch American defences, was quietly abandoned. Resources were redirected toward holding existing territory rather than expanding it. For American commanders, the victory was sobering rather than celebratory. They understood how narrow the margin had been. A few minutes' difference in timing, a missed sighting, a failed code interpretation, and the outcome could have reversed. Instead, Midway gave the United States something it had lacked since Pearl Harbor: initiative. Within weeks, plans were already forming for offensive operations in the Solomon Islands. The war would now move closer to Japan, island by island, carrier by carrier. The Pacific had not become safe, but it had become contested, and that change would echo far beyond the immediate wreckage of battle. In the months that followed Midway, its consequences deepened with every decision both sides were forced to make. For Japan, the loss of 4 carriers was not merely numerical, it was structural. Carrier warfare depended on experienced pilots, deck crews and commanders who understood the rhythm of flight operations under combat conditions. Japan had entered the war with a small, elite aviation corps designed for short, decisive campaigns. Midway shattered that assumption. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer hours, less combat experience, and limited opportunities for realistic training. The Imperial Navy could still fight, but it could no longer strike with the precision that had defined its early victories. Each subsequent engagement revealed the erosion. For the United States, Midway validated a new way of war. Intelligence, coordination, and adaptability had outweighed experience. Code breaking had become a weapon equal to aircraft and guns. The carrier, once considered a support vessel, was now undeniably the centerpiece of naval power. American shipyards accelerated production. New Essex-class carriers began entering service. Training programs expanded, rotating pilots through combat and instruction roles to preserve institutional knowledge. Losses were absorbed, lessons codified, doctrine rewritten in real time. The strategic initiative shifted permanently. In August 1942, American forces landed on Guadalcanal. The campaign was brutal and prolonged, but it was only possible because Midway had reduced Japan's ability to concentrate overwhelming force. Within the Japanese command structure, introspection was limited. Doctrine remained rigid. Yamamoto, though deeply affected, continued to seek decisive engagements, believing morale could compensate for material disadvantage. But the war had moved beyond singular battles. Midway marked the end of Japan's offensive phase. From that point forward, every operation would be reactive, designed to delay, attrit, or defend. The Pacific War became a contest of endurance, and in that contest, industrial capacity and adaptability mattered more than brilliance. By 1943, the pattern was clear. Japanese carriers sailed with thinner air groups. American task forces operated in depth, supported by logistics networks spanning thousands of miles. The destruction at Midway had not ended the war, it had reshaped it. History now looks back on those days in June not as an isolated victory, but as a hinge, one that redirected the entire trajectory of the conflict. All that remains is to consider what Midway ultimately meant. The Battle of Midway endures not because of its scale, but because of its precision. In the space of a single morning, power that had taken decades to build vanished in minutes. Steel, doctrine, experience, none of it proved immune to timing, uncertainty, and human judgment. Midway revealed how modern war no longer rewarded certainty, only adaptability. For the men who fought there, the victory was not abstract. It was survival measured in seconds, pilots who never returned, sailors who fought fires in choking smoke, commanders who made decisions without knowing whether the next report would confirm success or catastrophe. Midway also marked a deeper transformation. Intelligence became inseparable from combat. Information shaped outcomes before weapons ever met. The quiet work of code breakers altered the course of history without appearing on a single battlefield map. For Japan, Midway was the moment the future narrowed. From that point forward, every operation was an attempt to regain momentum that could no longer be sustained. For the United States, it was the first clear proof that defeat was not inevitable, that skill, preparation, and resilience could overcome early disaster. The Pacific War would grind on for 3 more brutal years. Islands would burn, cities would fall, weapons would grow more destructive. But the direction had been set. On the open ocean near a small atoll few had heard of before 1942, the age of Japanese naval dominance ended. Not with surrender, but with silence. And in that silence, history turned.